Margaret stared at her phone in disbelief. Her daughter was getting married, and she wasn't invited. Helen's voice came through the phone. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I thought you knew about Jennifer's wedding." Margaret's hands shook as she gripped the phone. "She didn't tell me," Margaret said quietly. Margaret dialed Jennifer's number. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. Jennifer looked at her phone screen, showing her mother's name. She declined the call and walked away. Margaret sat on the couch holding a photo of 8-year-old Jennifer. Tears fell onto the glass frame. The photo showed young Jennifer playing with dolls. "Mommy, will you play with me?" the child had asked repeatedly. Margaret worked late at her desk, surrounded by client files. After her husband died, work consumed most of her time. Margaret opened photo albums showing Jennifer's childhood milestones. Margaret appeared in very few of the pictures. One photo showed Jennifer at her nursing graduation. Margaret had arrived 20 minutes late that day. Margaret stood in front of the bathroom mirror. Her reflection showed tired eyes and gray hair. Margaret opened her laptop and began typing an email to Jennifer. She wrote for over an hour. Margaret's cursor hovered over the send button. She stared at the screen for several minutes. Margaret selected all the text and pressed delete. The screen went blank. Margaret lay in bed with her eyes open. The clock showed 3:47 a.m. as moonlight streamed through the window. At sunrise, Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching the neighborhood wake up. Margaret put on her best dress and combed her hair carefully in front of the bedroom mirror. Margaret wrote in a small notebook, filling 3 pages with her handwriting. Margaret picked up her car keys from the front hall table and opened the door. Margaret drove through the suburban streets, gripping the steering wheel with both hands. Margaret had begun her journey to find Jennifer. The next chapter would reveal what happened when mother and daughter finally met. Margaret sat beside her husband David's hospital bed. Jennifer, 8 years old, clutched her stuffed rabbit in the corner chair. The machines beeped steadily around David's bed as he breathed slowly. "Take care of our little girl," David whispered to Margaret. The doctors entered the room at 11:47 p.m. and checked David's vital signs. They spoke quietly to Margaret in the hallway afterward. Margaret returned to Jennifer and knelt beside the chair. "Daddy has gone to heaven," Margaret told her daughter. Jennifer looked up with wide eyes and asked when he would come home. Margaret wiped tears from her own face and held Jennifer close. Margaret wore a black dress at the funeral service. She held Jennifer's small hand as they walked between the cemetery headstones. Family and friends gathered around David's casket under the gray sky. The priest spoke about eternal rest and read from Scripture. Jennifer tugged on Margaret's dress and asked loudly, "When is Daddy coming home from his long sleep?" Margaret knelt down and whispered, "He's with the angels now, sweetheart." Several relatives approached Margaret after the service and offered their phone numbers. "Call if you need anything," they said before walking to their cars. Jennifer picked up a white rose and threw it onto the casket as dirt began covering it. Margaret spread bills and insurance documents across the kitchen table under a single lamp. She wrote numbers on a notepad and used a calculator repeatedly. The mortgage statement showed a payment due in 10 days. Jennifer's school supply list lay beside unpaid utility bills. Margaret opened David's life insurance papers and read the benefit amount again. She made a list on paper with rent, food, and Jennifer's needs written in columns. Margaret rubbed her eyes and looked at the clock showing 2:30 a.m. She gathered the papers into neat piles and turned off the lamp. The next morning would require finding solutions to their financial situation. Margaret put on her business suit at 5:30 a.m. every morning. She kissed sleeping Jennifer's forehead and left cereal and milk on the kitchen counter. Jennifer appeared at the bedroom window as Margaret backed out of the driveway. The little girl pressed her hand against the glass and waved goodbye. Margaret drove to the accounting firm, where she worked 10-hour shifts daily. Mrs. Henderson from next door knocked on their door at 7 a.m. to watch Jennifer until the school bus arrived. Margaret's briefcase contained client files that required evening attention at home. She worked through lunch breaks and volunteered for weekend assignments. The firm promoted her to senior accountant after 18 months of consistent overtime hours. Jennifer sat at the kitchen table with her homework spread in front of her. Margaret's chair remained empty as the clock showed 7 p.m. Jennifer read her spelling words aloud to the quiet room and practiced writing letters on lined paper. She made a peanut butter sandwich and poured herself a glass of milk for dinner. After finishing her assignments, Jennifer sat by the living room window watching for car headlights. The television played cartoons in the background while Jennifer drew pictures with her crayons. Her drawings showed 3 stick figures holding hands with "My family" written across the top. Jennifer climbed the stairs to bed when the clock showed 9 p.m., still before Margaret returned home. Margaret opened the front door at 10:30 p.m., carrying her briefcase and purse. The house was quiet with Jennifer already asleep upstairs. Margaret climbed the stairs and opened Jennifer's bedroom door quietly. Jennifer lay, sleeping with her drawings scattered across the desk beside her bed. Margaret picked up the pictures and examined them under the hallway light. Each drawing showed mothers and daughters playing together, swimming, and reading books. Margaret placed the drawings back on the desk and whispered, "I'm sorry, sweetheart." She closed the bedroom door and went downstairs to review more client files. Margaret set her alarm for 5 a.m. and promised herself tomorrow would include more time with Jennifer. Margaret worked alone in the office building after other employees went home to their families. The security guard made his rounds while cleaning staff emptied trash cans around her. Margaret reviewed tax documents and financial statements on her computer screen until 9 p.m. She called home and spoke to Jennifer, who was completing homework under Mrs. Henderson's supervision. "I'll be home soon, sweetheart," Margaret said into the phone. Jennifer replied, "Okay, Mommy," before hanging up. Margaret continued working for 2 more hours, earning overtime pay for Jennifer's college fund. She locked her office and drove home through empty streets, arriving after Jennifer's bedtime. Jennifer performed as the lead fairy in her school's spring production. She wore a sparkly costume with wings and recited her lines clearly to the audience. Margaret's reserved seat remained empty in the 3rd row of the auditorium. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row, recording the performance on her phone. After the final curtain, Jennifer searched the audience for Margaret's face, but only found Mrs. Henderson clapping enthusiastically. Other children ran to their parents for hugs and congratulations while Jennifer walked slowly to Mrs. Henderson. "Your mommy had to work late, but she'll be so proud when she sees this video," Mrs. Henderson said, giving Jennifer a warm hug and a bouquet of flowers. Margaret's colleagues gathered in the conference room with cake and champagne to celebrate her promotion to department manager. She accepted congratulations and a salary increase that would secure Jennifer's college fund. Margaret called Jennifer from her office to share the news. "That's great, Mom," Jennifer replied over the phone before saying she needed to finish her homework. Margaret stayed at the office until midnight, celebrating with co-workers who praised her dedication to career advancement. She drove home and found a handmade card on the kitchen counter. Jennifer had drawn Margaret sitting at her desk with "Supermom" written in red crayon across the top of the card. Jennifer sat alone at the cafeteria table during the school's Mother's Day lunch event. Other children laughed and shared meals with their mothers at surrounding tables. Margaret had promised to attend, but sent a text message about an emergency client meeting that couldn't be rescheduled. Jennifer ate her sandwich quietly and watched other families take photos together. Her teacher approached the table and sat beside Jennifer for company. "Your mother works very hard to provide for you," the teacher said gently. Jennifer nodded and finished her meal without speaking. She carried the Mother's Day gift she had made in art class back to her desk, where it remained wrapped and unopened. Margaret pushed open the door to Helen's flower shop. The brass bell above the entrance jingled as she stepped inside. Colorful arrangements filled every corner of the small store. Helen looked up from behind the counter where she was arranging white roses in a glass vase. "Margaret, what brings you here this morning?" Helen asked, setting down her scissors. Margaret approached the counter with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I need to talk to someone," Margaret said quietly. Helen wiped her hands on her green apron and gestured toward the small seating area near the window. The 2 women sat facing each other on wooden chairs. Margaret stared at her hands while Helen waited patiently for her to speak. Helen leaned forward in her chair and looked at Margaret's troubled face. "Tell me what's wrong, dear," Helen said gently. Margaret took a deep breath and clasped her hands together. "It's about Jennifer's wedding. I found out yesterday that she's getting married this Saturday, and I wasn't invited." Helen's eyes widened, and she reached across to touch Margaret's arm. "Oh, honey, there must be some misunderstanding," Helen replied. Margaret shook her head slowly and looked down at her hands. "No mistake. She deliberately didn't want me there." Helen stood up and walked to the refrigerated case, pulling out a bouquet of pink roses. She returned to her seat and began removing wilted petals without speaking. Helen set the roses on the small table between them and looked directly at Margaret. "I have something to tell you that might be difficult to hear," Helen said slowly. Margaret straightened in her chair and waited. "Jennifer came into the shop 3 days ago to order flowers for her wedding." Margaret's mouth opened slightly as Helen continued. "She was crying when she left here, Margaret. She stood right where you're sitting and told me she wanted to invite her mother, but didn't know how." Helen picked up one of the roses and twirled it between her fingers. "She said you two haven't really talked in years, not about anything that matters." Margaret stared at Helen without speaking for several long moments. Margaret's hands flew to cover her mouth. "She wanted to invite me?" Margaret whispered through her fingers. Helen nodded and continued arranging the roses in a new vase. Jennifer ordered white roses and baby's breath for her bouquet. When I asked about her family attending, she broke down completely. Margaret lowered her hands and leaned forward in her chair. "What exactly did she say?" Margaret asked urgently. Helen set down the roses and folded her hands in her lap. "She said her mother never seemed interested in her life, that you were always too busy with work to really listen when she tried to talk." Helen paused and watched Margaret's face change. "But she also said she missed having a real relationship with you and wished things could be different." Margaret stood up abruptly from her chair and began pacing between the flower displays. "I can't believe this," she said, running her hands through her gray hair. Helen watched Margaret move restlessly around the shop, knocking a few petals to the floor as she passed. "Jennifer told me she applied to colleges without your help because she assumed you wouldn't have time to discuss her plans." Margaret stopped pacing and turned to face Helen with wide eyes. "She never asked for my opinion about college," Margaret protested. Helen stood up and approached Margaret slowly. "Did you ever ask her about her plans? Or did you just assume she had everything figured out?" Helen asked gently. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Helen placed her hand on Margaret's shoulder as tears began forming in Margaret's eyes. "There's more you should know," Helen said softly. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and nodded for Helen to continue. "Jennifer mentioned that she used to write you letters when she was in nursing school, but never sent them because she was afraid you'd be too busy to read them." Margaret's tears began flowing freely as she listened. "She said she had so much she wanted to share with you about her patients, her studies, her dreams of helping people." Helen guided Margaret back to the chair and knelt beside her. "She also said she practices conversations with you in her head, imagining what it would be like to have a real mother-daughter relationship." Margaret sobbed quietly into her hands. Margaret accepted the tissues Helen offered and dried her tears slowly. "I never knew she wanted to share those things with me," Margaret said through her sniffles. "I thought I was being a good mother by giving her space to become independent." Helen returned to her own chair and picked up the pink roses again. "Jennifer told me she used to wait up for you when she was little, hoping you'd read her a bedtime story when you came home from work." Margaret looked up with red eyes and listened. "She said she eventually stopped waiting because you always came home after she fell asleep." Helen arranged the roses carefully in the vase while continuing to speak. "She learned to take care of herself because that's what seemed to be expected, not because that's what she wanted." Margaret wiped her nose with another tissue and stared at the floor. Helen moved to the counter and continued working with the flower arrangements. "Jennifer also mentioned David's old letters," Helen said quietly. Margaret looked up sharply at the mention of her late husband's name. "What letters?" Margaret asked, wiping her nose with a tissue. Helen turned around to face Margaret, while holding a stem of baby's breath. Apparently, David wrote letters to Jennifer before he died, telling her how much her mother loved her and how hard you would work to take care of her. Margaret's eyes widened as Helen continued. Jennifer said she rereads those letters when she misses having a close relationship with you. Helen returned to her arrangement and spoke without looking at Margaret. She said David predicted you would sacrifice everything for her future, even your own happiness. Margaret sat in silence, staring at Helen's back as she worked. Margaret walked to the flower shop window and stared out at the busy street. People hurried past carrying coffee cups and briefcases. How did I get it so wrong? Margaret said aloud to herself. Helen joined her at the window, carrying the finished arrangement of pink roses. You didn't get it wrong, Margaret. You just got so focused on providing for Jennifer that you forgot she needed you present, not just providing. Margaret watched a mother and teenage daughter walking together, laughing and talking. I want to give her everything I never had, Margaret said quietly. Helen set the vase on the windowsill and stood beside Margaret. What you never had was financial security, but what Jennifer never had was emotional connection with her mother. Margaret nodded slowly. The two women stood silently, watching people walk past the window. Margaret turned away from the window and looked at Helen directly. I need to find Jennifer and talk to her before Saturday, Margaret announced. Helen smiled and nodded. She's probably at the hospital finishing her shift right now, Helen suggested. Margaret gathered her purse and headed toward the door. Thank you for telling me all of this, Helen. I don't know what I would have done without knowing the truth. Helen followed Margaret to the door and gave her a hug. Good luck, dear. Jennifer needs to know how much you love her before she gets married. Margaret pushed open the door and paused as the bell jingled above her head. If this works out, you'll be doing flowers for a very special mother-daughter reunion, Margaret said with a smile. Helen watched through the window as Margaret walked quickly down the street toward her car. Margaret stood on the front porch of Jennifer's small suburban house and pressed the doorbell. She waited several minutes, but heard no movement inside. Margaret knocked on the wooden door with her knuckles and called out, Jennifer, it's Mom. Are you home? No response came from within the house. Margaret walked around to the side yard and peered through the living room window. The house appeared empty, with no lights on inside. She returned to the front door and tried the handle, but it was locked. Margaret sat down on the porch steps and checked her watch. It was 3:30 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. Jennifer was probably still at work at the hospital. Margaret decided to wait and see if her daughter would come home soon. After an hour of waiting, Margaret saw a man walking up the driveway, carrying grocery bags. He had short brown hair and wore business casual clothing. The man stopped when he saw Margaret sitting on the porch steps. Can I help you? He asked politely, setting down the bags and approaching cautiously. Margaret stood up and smoothed her dress. I'm Margaret, Jennifer's mother, she said, extending her hand. The man's expression changed to surprise and then wariness. I'm David, Jennifer's fiancé, he replied, shaking her hand briefly. He picked up his grocery bags and walked toward the front door. Jennifer didn't mention you were coming by, David said while searching for his keys. Margaret followed him to the door. She doesn't know I'm here. I need to talk to her about the wedding. David found his keys, but didn't immediately unlock the door. He turned to face Margaret with a guarded expression. Look, Mrs. He paused, waiting for her last name. Margaret Thompson, she supplied. Mrs. Thompson, I'm not sure this is a good idea. Jennifer is at work right now, and she's been pretty upset about family stuff lately. Margaret stepped closer to David. That's exactly why I need to talk to her. I found out about the wedding yesterday, and I want to understand what happened between us. David shifted the grocery bags to one arm and looked at Margaret carefully. She never talks about you much, but when she does, it's usually because she's crying. Margaret's face showed pain at hearing this information. David unlocked the door, but blocked the entrance. Maybe you should call first and arrange a proper meeting. Margaret looked at David with desperate eyes. Please, I know I've made mistakes as a mother. I just learned some things today that made me realize how much I've hurt Jennifer without meaning to. David studied Margaret's face for signs of sincerity. What kind of things? He asked, still blocking the doorway. Margaret clasped her hands together. I found out that she wanted to invite me to the wedding, but was afraid I wouldn't care enough to come. I had no idea she felt that way about our relationship. David's expression softened slightly, but he remained cautious. Jennifer cries about you at least once a week, David said bluntly. She talks about wanting her mom to be proud of her, to be interested in her life, to actually show up for important things. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as David continued. She's convinced you think she's a disappointment. David set his grocery bags down on the porch and crossed his arms. Jennifer tells me stories about growing up basically alone while you worked all the time, he said directly to Margaret. She said you missed her school plays, her graduation parties, her nursing school pinning ceremony. Margaret wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. I was working to pay for all of those things. I thought providing for her was the most important thing I could do as a single mother. David shook his head. She didn't need expensive things, Mrs. Thompson. She needed her mother to show up. Margaret looked down at her feet. I realize that now. I made terrible choices thinking I was doing the right thing. David watched Margaret cry quietly on his porch. She keeps all the programs from events you missed in a shoebox in her closet, David said more gently. Margaret sobbed openly while David stood watching her. I never knew she kept those programs, Margaret said through her tears. I never knew she wanted me there so badly. David handed Margaret a tissue from his pocket. There's more you probably don't know, David said, sitting down on the porch railing. Jennifer writes you letters every year on your birthday and Christmas, but never sends them. Margaret looked up at David with red eyes. What do the letters say? She asked quietly. David looked toward the street as neighbors walked their dogs. They say how much she misses having a real relationship with you, how she wishes she could call and tell you about her patients, her hopes, her fears. Margaret wiped her nose with the tissue. She also writes about memories from when she was little, before you became so focused on work. David turned back to Margaret. She remembers you reading her bedtime stories and making pancakes on Saturday mornings. David continued talking while Margaret listened through her tears. Jennifer keeps a photo of the two of you from when she was about 5 years old. You're both laughing in the picture, and she was helping you bake cookies in the kitchen. Margaret looked up with surprise. I remember that day, she said softly. It was right after David died, and I was trying to make Christmas special for her. David nodded. She said it was one of the last times she remembered you being fully present with her, not thinking about work or bills or anything else. Margaret cried harder as David continued. She carries that photo in her wallet and looks at it when she's having a bad day at the hospital. David stood up from the railing and faced Margaret directly. She's planning to carry something of yours in her wedding bouquet, even though you're not invited. Margaret's sobbing intensified as she heard about her daughter's hidden love for her. Margaret dried her tears and looked up at David with new hope in her eyes. What is she planning to carry? Margaret asked. David hesitated before answering. A small piece of fabric from one of your old dresses. She cut it from a blue dress you used to wear when she was little. Margaret's mouth opened in amazement. The blue dress with tiny flowers? She asked. David nodded. She said you wore it to her kindergarten Mother's Day program, and it was the prettiest she'd ever seen you look. Margaret closed her eyes and remembered that dress and that day. I was so proud of her that day. She sang a solo in the school choir. David watched Margaret's face change as the memory returned. She still talks about how you clapped louder than any other parent in the audience. Margaret opened her eyes and looked directly at David. I need to see her before Saturday. Please help me figure out how to reach her. David checked his watch and looked down the street toward the hospital. Jennifer gets off work at 6 o'clock, he said. She usually comes straight home unless she stops at the grocery store. Margaret stood up from the porch steps and smoothed her clothes. Would you let me wait here until she comes home? Margaret asked hopefully. David considered this request carefully. I don't know if that's a good idea. She might feel ambushed if she finds you here without warning. Margaret nodded in understanding. Then can you call her and tell her I want to talk? That I know about the wedding and I'm not angry, just heartbroken that we've grown so far apart. David pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at it. She might hang up if I mention you're here, he warned Margaret. Or she might drive to a friend's house and avoid coming home until you're gone. Margaret picked up her purse from the porch step. Then I'll come back tomorrow and try again. and the next day if necessary. David held his phone but didn't dial yet. Wait, he called to Margaret as she walked toward her car. Margaret turned around in the driveway. Maybe there's another way to handle this, David said, walking down the porch steps toward her. Jennifer volunteers at the Children's Hospital on Thursday mornings. She reads to the pediatric patients from 9 to 11. Margaret stopped walking and turned to face David completely. She volunteers with children? Margaret asked with surprise. David nodded. Every week for the past 2 years. She says it's the best part of her job. Margaret smiled through her remaining tears. She always loved children, even when she was little herself. David put his phone back in his pocket. If you showed up there tomorrow morning, she couldn't avoid you, and she'd be in a place that makes her happy. Margaret walked back toward the porch. Would you call her tonight and prepare her? Tell her I'll be there and that I love her more than she knows. David picked up his grocery bags and headed for the front door. I'll try, Mrs. Thompson. But Jennifer makes her own decisions about who she lets into her life. Margaret climbed the narrow wooden stairs to her attic, each step creaking under her weight. She held a small flashlight to guide her way through the dim space filled with boxes and old furniture. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through a small window at the far end of the attic. Margaret had not been up here in over 2 years, not since she stored David's remaining belongings after finally accepting his death. She moved carefully between stacked boxes, reading the labels she had written in black marker years ago. Christmas decorations, Jennifer's school papers, David's books, and tax records were scattered throughout the cramped space. Margaret searched for a particular box that she remembered storing in the corner near the old rocking chair that had belonged to her mother. Margaret found the box she was looking for tucked behind a stack of old photo albums. The cardboard was slightly yellowed with age, and the words personal letters were written in her own handwriting across the top. She carefully lifted the box and carried it to the small window where the light was better. Margaret sat cross-legged on the dusty floor and slowly opened the box flaps. Inside were hundreds of letters, cards, and papers she had saved over the years. Some were condolence cards from David's funeral. Others were birthday cards from Jennifer when she was young. Margaret began sorting through the contents methodically, looking for something specific that she remembered putting away long ago. Her hands moved gently through the papers, treating each item like a precious artifact from her past. Near the bottom of the box, Margaret found a stack of sealed envelopes held together with a rubber band. The rubber band had aged and snapped when she touched it, scattering the envelopes across her lap. Margaret picked up the first envelope and read the front in her own handwriting. For Jennifer, 16th birthday. The next envelope read, For Jennifer, high school graduation. Margaret continued reading the labels on each envelope with growing amazement. For Jennifer, first day of college. For Jennifer, nursing school acceptance. For Jennifer, 21st birthday, and many more. There were over 20 envelopes in total, all addressed to Jennifer in different celebrations and milestones. Margaret had completely forgotten about writing these letters over the years. She carefully opened the first envelope and began reading the letter inside. Margaret unfolded the letter dated 16 years ago and read her own words aloud in the quiet attic. My dearest Jennifer, today you turn 16, and I am so proud of the young woman you are becoming. I know I work too much and I miss too many of your important moments, but I want you to know that every sacrifice I make is because I love you more than life itself. Margaret's voice caught in her throat as she continued reading. You are kind, intelligent, and compassionate in ways that amaze me every day. I see you helping your friends with their problems, volunteering at the animal shelter, and studying so hard to achieve your dreams. Margaret set down the first letter and opened another envelope labeled Nursing School Graduation. The letter was filled with expressions of pride, love, and hopes for Jennifer's future career helping others. Margaret had written detailed observations about Jennifer's character, her achievements, and her mother's deep admiration for her. Margaret opened letter after letter, reading years of unspoken love and pride she had written but never shared. Each letter contained specific memories, detailed observations about Jennifer's growth, and expressions of maternal love that Margaret had never spoken aloud. One letter described Jennifer's performance in her high school drama club. Another praised her dedication to her nursing studies and her natural ability to comfort patients. Margaret found a letter she had written after Jennifer's first heartbreak, offering comfort and wisdom about love and relationships. Every major milestone in Jennifer's life had a corresponding letter filled with Margaret's thoughts, feelings, and pride. Margaret spread the letters across the dusty attic floor and stared at them in amazement. She had documented her love for Jennifer in writing, but had never found the courage to share these feelings directly. Margaret picked up a letter dated just 2 years ago, written after Jennifer completed her nursing degree. "My beautiful daughter, I watched you walk across that stage today, and my heart nearly burst with pride. You have accomplished something I never could. You found a career that lets you heal people and make a real difference in the world." Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as she continued reading her own words. "I know I arrived late to your graduation ceremony, and I saw the disappointment in your eyes when you found me in the audience. What you couldn't see was that I've been crying tears of joy in the parking lot, overwhelmed by how incredible you have become." Margaret set down the letter and picked up another one. This letter was written after Jennifer's engagement to David. "I am so happy you found someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. David sees the amazing woman I raised, even if I fail to show you how amazing I think you are." Margaret found a letter she had written just 6 months ago after visiting Jennifer at the hospital during her shift. "Today I stopped by the hospital to bring you lunch, and I watched you with your patients for a few minutes before you saw me. The way you held that elderly woman's hand while she cried, the patience you showed with the frightened child, the gentle way you explained procedures to worried families. I realized that you became everything I hoped you would be and more." Margaret's voice broke as she read the next paragraph aloud. "I wanted to tell you how proud I was in that moment, but when you saw me, you just seemed surprised and a little annoyed that I had interrupted your workday. I left feeling like I had bothered you, when really I had come to tell you that watching you work was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." Margaret closed the letter and held it against her chest. She had written dozens of letters expressing love and admiration, but had never shared a single one with Jennifer. Margaret carefully gathered all the letters and arranged them in chronological order on the attic floor. She counted 23 letters spanning Jennifer's life from age 16 to present day. Each letter captured a specific moment when Margaret had felt overwhelming love and pride for her daughter, but had failed to express those feelings directly. Margaret stood up and walked to the small attic window, looking out at her neighborhood while holding the stack of letters. She could see children playing in their yards while their mothers watched from porches and kitchen windows. Margaret turned back to the letters spread across the floor. These letters represented 23 missed opportunities to connect with Jennifer, 23 times when Margaret had chosen to write her feelings privately instead of sharing them with her daughter. Margaret made a decision. She would take these letters to Jennifer before the wedding and finally share the love she had been hiding for years. Margaret found a large manila envelope in another box and carefully placed all 23 letters inside. She wrote for Jennifer, "All my love," always across the front of the envelope in clear handwriting. Margaret also found a letter she had started writing the night before but never finished. She sat down on the dusty floor and completed the letter using a pen from her purse. "My dearest Jennifer, I have failed as a mother in many ways, but my love for you has never failed. These letters represent years of pride, admiration, and love that I was too scared or too busy to share with you directly. I wrote them during your most important moments, and I want you to have them now, before you begin this new chapter of your life." Margaret sealed the completed letter in with all the others. She stood up and brushed dust from her clothes, holding the envelope carefully in both hands. The attic suddenly felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from the stored memories. Margaret descended the attic stairs carefully, protecting the envelope of letters like precious cargo. She emerged into the hallway of her house and looked at the envelope in the better lighting. 23 letters representing 23 years of unspoken love now had a chance to reach Jennifer before her wedding day. Margaret walked to the kitchen and placed the envelope on the table while she made herself a cup of tea. She sat down and stared at the envelope, thinking about David's suggestion to meet Jennifer at the children's hospital the next morning. Margaret opened her purse and pulled out a small notebook where she began writing a plan for how to approach her daughter. She would arrive early, wait until Jennifer finished reading to the children, and then ask for just a few minutes to share these letters. Margaret finished her tea and held the envelope against her heart. Tomorrow would determine whether 23 years of hidden love could heal the distance between mother and daughter. Margaret sat at her kitchen table with her phone in hand, staring at Jennifer's contact information on the screen. The manila envelope containing 23 letters lay beside her untouched breakfast. Margaret had been awake since 5 in the morning, rehearsing what she would say to her daughter. She pressed the call button and held the phone to her ear with a trembling hand. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before Jennifer's voice came through. "Hello," Jennifer said, sounding tired and slightly annoyed. Margaret took a deep breath before speaking. "Jennifer, it's Mom. Please don't hang up. I need to talk to you about something very important." There was silence on the other end of the line for several long seconds. Margaret waited, holding her breath and praying her daughter wouldn't disconnect the call. Jennifer sat in the hospital break room during her lunch break, holding her phone tightly against her ear. "What do you want, Mom?" Jennifer asked with a guarded tone. Her coworkers were eating nearby, but she lowered her voice to avoid their attention. Margaret's voice came through the phone clearly. "I know about the wedding, Jennifer. I know it's this Saturday, and I know I wasn't invited." Jennifer's expression hardened as she listened. "Helen told you," Jennifer said flatly, not asking a question. Margaret confirmed this over the phone. "Yes, Helen told me. But she also told me some other things that broke my heart." Jennifer stood up from the break room table and walked toward the window overlooking the hospital parking lot. "I don't want to have this conversation right now," Jennifer said firmly. "I'm at work, and I have patients who need me." Margaret gripped the phone tighter and spoke more urgently. "Jennifer, please just listen to me for 2 minutes. Helen told me that you wanted to invite me, but thought I wouldn't care enough to come." Margaret's voice cracked slightly as she continued. "She told me that you've been hurting for years because you felt like I never cared about your life." Jennifer's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "That's not something I want to discuss over the phone," Jennifer replied coldly. Margaret pressed on despite her daughter's resistance. "I found something in the attic yesterday that I need to show you. Letters I wrote to you over the years, but never gave you. Letters that prove how much I love you and how proud I am of everything you've accomplished." Jennifer's silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before she responded. "Why didn't you give me those letters when they mattered?" Jennifer left the break room and walked into the hospital corridor, speaking more loudly into her phone. "Do you have any idea how many times I wanted to call you and share good news, only to convince myself that you'd be too busy to care?" Jennifer's voice carried frustration and pain accumulated over years. "Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep wondering why my own mother seemed more interested in her work than in me?" Margaret tried to interrupt, but Jennifer continued speaking. "I graduated nursing school with honors, Mom. I won an award for compassionate patient care. I got engaged to a wonderful man who loves me. And through all of it, I felt like an orphan because my mother was physically present but emotionally absent." Hospital staff members glanced at Jennifer as they passed, but she was too focused on the conversation to notice their concern. Margaret began crying as she listened to Jennifer's pain spill out over the phone. "I know I failed you, Jennifer. I know I made terrible choices thinking I was being a good provider when you needed me to be present." Margaret wiped her tears with a tissue while still holding the phone. "After your father died, I was so scared of losing our house, of not being able to send you to college, of failing to give you the opportunities you deserved." Jennifer's voice came through the phone, sharp and bitter. "I didn't need opportunities, Mom. I needed my mother to show up. I needed you to ask about my day, to celebrate my achievements, to comfort me when I was scared." Margaret clutched the envelope of letters tighter. "That's what the letters are about, Jennifer. I did celebrate your achievements. I did notice your accomplishments. I just never knew how to tell you directly." The phone line went quiet again as Jennifer processed this information. Jennifer leaned against the hospital wall and closed her eyes while listening to her mother cry. "Letters don't replace actual conversations, Mom," Jennifer said more quietly. "Letters don't replace hugs when I was heartbroken or encouragement when I was struggling in school." Margaret's voice came through the phone, pleading. "I know that now. I understand how badly I hurt you by working so much and being emotionally unavailable." Jennifer opened her eyes and stared at the hospital ceiling. "I used to practice conversations with you in my head, imagining what it would be like to have a mother who actually wanted to know about my life." Margaret's crying intensified as Jennifer continued. "I would rehearse telling you about my patients, my hopes for the future, my fears about whether I was good enough to be a nurse." Jennifer pushed away from the wall and began walking again. "But every time I tried to start those conversations in real life, you seemed distracted or tired or focused on something else." Margaret stood up from the kitchen table and began pacing while holding the phone and the envelope. "Jennifer, I want to change. I want to have those conversations now, if you'll give me a chance." Margaret's voice became more urgent. "I want to hear about your patients and your dreams and everything I missed over the years." Jennifer's response was immediate and firm. "It's too late for that, Mom. I'm getting married on Saturday and starting a new life with David. I can't keep waiting for you to decide that I'm worth your time and attention." Margaret stopped pacing and gripped the phone tighter. "Please don't say it's too late. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be part of your future." Jennifer's voice carried years of accumulated disappointment. "You had 28 years to be part of my life, and you chose work instead. I can't risk having my heart broken by you again." Margaret sat back down at the kitchen table, feeling defeated. Jennifer found an empty bench in the hospital lobby and sat down heavily. "I have to get back to work, Mom," Jennifer said with finality in her voice. Margaret spoke quickly, sensing the conversation was ending. "Will you at least let me see you before the wedding? Will you let me give you these letters and explain how much you mean to me?" Jennifer stared across the hospital lobby at families visiting patients, watching mothers comforting their children. "I don't know if I can handle seeing you right now," Jennifer replied honestly. "I've spent years building walls to protect myself from being disappointed by you again." Margaret's voice became desperate. "Jennifer, please. I'm begging you to give me one chance to show you how much I love you." Jennifer stood up from the bench and walked toward the elevator. "I need time to think about this," Jennifer said finally. "I can't make any decisions while I'm at work trying to take care of sick people." The elevator doors opened and Jennifer stepped inside. Margaret pressed the envelope of letters against her chest while pleading into the phone. "Jennifer, I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking you to consider meeting me somewhere neutral where we can talk without pressure." Margaret's tears fell onto the kitchen table as she spoke. "I have 23 letters that prove how much I've always loved you, how proud I've always been of you, how much I've always admired the incredible woman you've become." Jennifer's voice came through the phone from inside the hospital elevator. "Why should I believe that now when you never showed it before?" Margaret wiped her face with her sleeve. "Because I was a scared, foolish woman who thought providing for you financially was the same as loving you emotionally. Because I was wrong about everything that mattered." The elevator dinged in the background of Jennifer's call. "I have to go, Mom. I have patients waiting for me." Jennifer's voice softened slightly. "Maybe we can talk more later, but I can't do this right now." Margaret held the phone against her ear for several seconds after Jennifer ended the call. The dial tone buzzed until Margaret finally set the phone down on the kitchen table. She sat in silence, staring at the envelope of letters that represented years of unexpressed love. Margaret opened the envelope and pulled out one of the letters, reading it again in the afternoon sunlight streaming through her kitchen window. The letter expressed pride in Jennifer's nursing career and admiration for her compassionate nature with patients. Margaret folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. She stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at her backyard where Jennifer used to play as a child. The swing set was still there, rusty and in use for over 15 years. Margaret made a decision. She would not give up on her daughter, even if Jennifer needed time to process their conversation. Margaret picked up the envelope and her car keys. She had one more chance to reach Jennifer before the wedding, and she would not waste it. Margaret climbed the stone steps leading to St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, clutching the manila envelope of letters under her arm. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the church courtyard as she approached the heavy wooden doors. Margaret had attended this church sporadically over the years, usually during Christmas and Easter services. She pulled open the door and stepped into the quiet sanctuary, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim interior lighting. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward the altar, and stained glass windows filtered colorful light across the empty space. Margaret walked slowly down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor. She had come here seeking guidance from Pastor Williams, hoping he could offer wisdom about healing the relationship with her daughter before Saturday's wedding. Pastor Williams emerged from a side door near the altar, wearing his black clerical shirt and white collar. He smiled warmly when he saw Margaret sitting in the front pew. "Margaret Thompson, what a pleasant surprise," Pastor Williams said, walking toward her with outstretched hands. "I haven't seen you here in quite some time." Margaret stood up and shook the pastor's hands, holding the envelope tightly in her other arm. "Pastor Williams, I hope you have a few minutes to talk. I'm facing a crisis with my daughter, and I need spiritual guidance." The pastor gestured toward his office door. "Of course, Margaret. Let's go to my office where we can speak privately." Margaret followed him across the sanctuary, grateful for his immediate willingness to listen. Pastor Williams opened his office door and invited her inside the comfortable space filled with books and religious artifacts. Margaret sat in a comfortable chair across from Pastor Williams's desk, placing the manila envelope carefully on her lap. The pastor's office was warm and inviting, filled with theological books and small religious statues. "Tell me what's troubling you, Margaret," Pastor Williams said gently, settling into his chair behind the desk. Margaret took a deep breath and looked down at the envelope. "My daughter Jennifer is getting married this Saturday, and she didn't invite me to the wedding." Pastor Williams's eyebrows raised in concern. "That must be incredibly painful for you," he said softly. Margaret nodded and continued. "I found out by accident from a friend, and when I tried to talk to Jennifer about it, she told me she's been hurt for years by my emotional absence." Margaret's voice began to shake as she spoke. She said, "I was always too busy with work to really care about her life, and she's convinced I think she's a disappointment." Pastor Williams leaned forward in his chair, giving Margaret his full attention. "How do you feel about what Jennifer told you?" he asked thoughtfully. Margaret wiped her eyes with a tissue from the box on his desk. "I feel like I failed completely as a mother. I thought I was doing the right thing by working so hard to provide for her after my husband died." Pastor Williams nodded understandingly. "Grief and fear can make us focus on the wrong priorities sometimes," he said gently. Margaret clutched the envelope tighter. "I found these letters I wrote to Jennifer over the years but never gave to her. They're filled with love and pride and everything I should have told her directly." She handed the envelope to Pastor Williams. "I wrote them during all her important milestones, but I was too scared or too busy to share my feelings with her in person." Pastor Williams accepted the envelope and looked at Margaret with compassionate eyes. Pastor Williams carefully opened the envelope and pulled out one of Margaret's letters. He read silently for several minutes while Margaret watched his face for reactions. "This letter is beautiful, Margaret," Pastor Williams said finally. "You wrote about Jennifer's nursing school graduation with such pride and love." Margaret leaned forward in her chair. "I wrote one like that for every important event in her life. 23 letters total, spanning 12 years. Pastor Williams returned the letter to the envelope and set it on his desk. "Why do you think you found it easier to express your love in writing than in person?" he asked gently. Margaret considered the question carefully. "I think I was afraid of being vulnerable. After David died, I felt like I had to be strong all the time, like showing emotion would make me seem weak or unreliable." Pastor Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes we mistake emotional walls for strength, when actually they prevent us from experiencing the connections we crave most." Margaret began crying as she continued talking to Pastor Williams. Jennifer told me she used to practice conversations with me in her head because she wanted so badly to share her life with me. Margaret's tears fell steadily as she spoke. She said she would rehearse telling me about her patients, her dreams, her fears, but when she tried to have those conversations in real life, I seemed distracted or uninterested. Pastor Williams handed Margaret another tissue and waited patiently for her to continue. The worst part is that I was interested. I was proud of her. I loved hearing about her work, but I was so focused on solving problems and providing practical support that I never just listened and celebrated with her. Margaret looked directly at Pastor Williams. How do I fix 28 years of emotional distance in the next 3 days before her wedding? Pastor Williams considered her question carefully before responding. Pastor Williams folded his hands on his desk and spoke earnestly to Margaret. The first step in any reconciliation is genuine repentance and the willingness to take responsibility for your actions without making excuses. Margaret nodded and wiped her tears. I know I was wrong to prioritize work over relationship. I know I hurt Jennifer by being emotionally unavailable. Pastor Williams continued. The second step is demonstrating through actions, not just words, that you understand the depth of the hurt you've caused. He gestured toward the envelope of letters. These letters are a good start because they prove your love was real, even if it was unexpressed. Margaret leaned forward attentively. But Jennifer needs to see that you're willing to change your patterns of behavior, not just apologize for past mistakes. Pastor Williams stood up and walked around the desk to sit in the chair beside Margaret. True forgiveness often requires seeing genuine transformation in the person who caused the pain. Margaret looked at Pastor Williams with growing hope in her eyes. What kind of transformation do you think Jennifer needs to see from me? She asked. Pastor Williams smiled gently. She needs to see that you value relationship over productivity, that you prioritize presence over providing. Margaret nodded as she absorbed his words. She needs evidence that you won't disappear back into work mode after this crisis passes, that your desire for connection is permanent, not temporary. Pastor Williams reached over and touched Margaret's hand supportively. Most importantly, she needs to experience unconditional love from you. Love that doesn't depend on her achievements or success, but simply exists because she is your daughter. Margaret's crying subsided as she listened to his guidance. How do I show her all of that in just a few days? Margaret asked. Pastor Williams picked up the envelope of letters. Start with complete honesty about your failures. Share these letters that prove your hidden love, and then commit to specific changes in how you interact with her going forward. Pastor Williams suggested they pray together before Margaret left his office. Both Margaret and Pastor Williams bowed their heads as he spoke aloud. Dear Lord, we ask for your guidance in healing the relationship between Margaret and Jennifer. Help Margaret find the courage to be completely vulnerable with her daughter, and help Jennifer find the grace to listen with an open heart. Margaret added her own prayer silently, while Pastor Williams continued. Give them both the strength to move past years of hurt and misunderstanding toward genuine reconciliation and love. Pastor Williams concluded the prayer, and both he and Margaret raised their heads. Margaret felt a sense of peace and determination settling over her. Thank you, Pastor Williams. I know what I need to do now. She stood up and picked up the envelope of letters. I'm going to find Jennifer and give her these letters, and I'm going to ask for her forgiveness without making any excuses for my failures. Pastor Williams stood up and walked Margaret to his office door. Margaret paused at the church entrance and turned back to Pastor Williams, who stood in his office doorway. Will you pray for us on Saturday? Margaret asked hopefully. Whether Jennifer allows me to attend her wedding or not, I want her to have a blessed beginning to her marriage. Pastor Williams smiled warmly. Of course I will pray for both of you. And Margaret, remember that healing relationships takes time. Don't expect all the hurt to disappear immediately, but have faith that God can restore what seems impossible to repair. Margaret nodded gratefully and pushed open the church door. Thank you for reminding me that love requires action, not just good intentions. She stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight, holding the envelope of letters and carrying new determination in her heart. Pastor Williams watched from the doorway as Margaret walked down the church steps toward her car. Margaret drove away from the church with a clear plan to find Jennifer and finally share 23 years of unexpressed maternal love. Margaret drove through the quiet suburban streets at 8:30 a.m. on Saturday morning, the manila envelope of letters secured on the passenger seat beside her. She had barely slept the night before, rehearsing what she would say to Jennifer at the church. Margaret wore her best navy blue dress and had styled her gray hair carefully for the occasion. The wedding was scheduled to begin at 2 p.m., but Margaret wanted to arrive early to speak with Jennifer before the ceremony preparations began in earnest. She turned onto Elm Street and saw St. Mary's Catholic Church ahead, its tall spire reaching into the clear morning sky. Several cars were already parked in the church lot, likely belonging to the wedding party and early vendors. Margaret pulled into a parking space near the back of the lot and sat in her car for a moment, gathering courage for what lay ahead. Margaret stepped out of her car and walked across the church parking lot, clutching the envelope of letters against her chest. Her heels clicked on the asphalt as she approached the side entrance of the church where a sign indicated bridal party entrance. Margaret could hear voices and activity coming from inside the building. She paused at the door and took several deep breaths before knocking gently. After a few moments, the door opened to reveal a young woman in casual clothes with a clipboard in her hand. "Can I help you?" the woman asked politely. Margaret straightened her shoulders and spoke clearly. "I'm Margaret Thompson, Jennifer's mother. I need to speak with my daughter before the ceremony begins." The woman's expression changed to surprise and then uncertainty. Let me check with Jennifer," she said, partially closing the door. Margaret waited outside, hearing muffled conversations from within the church. Jennifer stood in the church bridal room wearing a white silk robe, her long auburn hair in curlers. She froze when her maid of honor whispered that her mother was outside asking to see her. Jennifer's 3 bridesmaids stopped their preparations and looked at her with concern. "What should I tell her?" the maid of honor asked quietly. Jennifer stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror, seeing her own shocked expression. "I can't deal with this right now," Jennifer said, her voice shaking slightly. "Today is supposed to be the happiest day of my life." One of the bridesmaids approached Jennifer and placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. "What do you want to do, Jen?" she asked gently. Jennifer closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. "Tell her I need a few minutes to think," Jennifer said finally. "Ask her to wait in the sanctuary while I decide if I'm ready to see her." The maid of honor nodded and left the room to relay the message. Margaret sat alone in the 3rd row of the empty church sanctuary, the envelope of letters resting on her lap. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the wooden pews and stone floor. Margaret looked toward the altar where Jennifer would stand with David in just a few hours, exchanging vows and beginning her married life. The church was beautifully decorated with white roses and baby's breath, the same flowers Helen had mentioned Jennifer ordering from her shop. Margaret opened the envelope and pulled out one of the letters, reading it silently to calm her nerves. The letter was dated 3 years ago after Jennifer had received a commendation at the hospital for excellent patient care. Margaret had written about her pride in Jennifer's compassion and dedication to healing others. She folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope, praying that Jennifer would give her the chance to share these expressions of love. Jennifer entered the sanctuary wearing her white robe, having removed the curlers from her hair. Her long auburn hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders as she walked slowly down the center aisle toward Margaret. Jennifer's expression was guarded and cautious as she approached the pew where her mother sat waiting. Margaret stood up when she saw Jennifer approaching, clutching the envelope tightly in both hands. "Thank you for seeing me," Margaret said quietly. Jennifer stopped several feet away from Margaret, maintaining physical distance between them. "You have 5 minutes," Jennifer said firmly. "My photographer arrives at 10 o'clock, and I need to start getting ready." Margaret nodded gratefully and gestured toward the pew. "Will you sit with me for just a few minutes?" Margaret asked hopefully. Jennifer hesitated before sliding into the pew, leaving an empty space between herself and her mother. Both women sat facing forward toward the altar, the envelope of letters visible between them. Margaret turned in the pew to face Jennifer and extended the manila envelope toward her. "Before I say anything else, I want you to have these," Margaret said with trembling hands. Jennifer looked at the envelope suspiciously without taking it. "What are they?" Jennifer asked. Margaret set the envelope on the pew between them, where Jennifer could see it clearly. "They're letters I wrote to you over the years, but never gave you. 23 letters covering every important milestone in your life since you turned 16. Jennifer's expression softened slightly with curiosity. "I wrote them when I was feeling overwhelmed with pride and love for you, but I was too scared or too busy to share those feelings directly," Margaret continued. Jennifer picked up the envelope and looked at her name written across the front in her mother's handwriting. "All my love, always," Jennifer read aloud from the envelope. Her hand shook slightly as she held it. "Why didn't you give these to me when they mattered?" Jennifer asked, echoing her question from their phone conversation. Margaret clasped her hands together and spoke earnestly to Jennifer. "Because I was a coward who thought providing for you financially was the same as loving you emotionally." Margaret's voice carried deep regret as she continued. "Because I was so afraid of losing you to poverty that I lost you to my own emotional unavailability instead." Jennifer opened the envelope and pulled out the top letter, scanning the first few lines. Margaret watched her daughter's face as she read expressions of maternal pride and love that had been hidden for years. "I thought I was being strong by working so much, but I was actually being weak by avoiding the vulnerability that real relationships require," Margaret said quietly. Jennifer looked up from the letter with tears forming in her eyes. "This letter is about my nursing school graduation," Jennifer said softly. "You wrote that you were proud of my compassion with patience." Margaret nodded. "I noticed everything, Jennifer. I celebrated every achievement, even if I did it silently. Those letters prove that my love for you was real, even when my actions suggested otherwise." Jennifer read several more lines from the letter, her tears beginning to fall onto the paper. "You wrote that watching me with patience was the most beautiful thing you'd ever seen," Jennifer said, her voice cracking with emotion. Margaret leaned closer to her daughter in the pew. "It was true then, and it's still true now. You became everything I hoped you would become and more." Jennifer pulled out another letter from the envelope, this one dated from her high school graduation. "I remember that day," Jennifer said softly. "You arrived late because of work, and I was so disappointed." Margaret's own tears began falling as she watched Jennifer read. "I was crying tears of joy in the parking lot before I came inside," Margaret said. "I was overwhelmed by how incredible you had become, but I never told you that." Jennifer looked up from the letters with red eyes. "I needed to hear those words from you directly, not read them years later in secret letters." Margaret nodded in acknowledgement. "I know that now. I robbed both of us of so many opportunities for connection because I was afraid of being vulnerable." Margaret reached toward Jennifer in the church pew, not quite touching her, but showing her desire for connection. "Jennifer, I know I can't undo 28 years of emotional distance with a stack of letters," Margaret said through her tears. "But I want you to know that my love for you has never wavered, even when my ability to express it failed completely." Jennifer held several letters in her hands, reading portions of each one. "There's a letter here about every important event in my life," Jennifer said with amazement. "My first day of nursing school, my engagement to David, even the day I got my driver's license." Margaret smiled through her tears. "I documented every milestone because each one filled me with such pride and joy. I just never knew how to share those feelings with you directly." Jennifer set the letters down and looked at her mother for the first time with softened eyes. "Why are you giving these to me today?" Jennifer asked quietly. "Because I realized that hiding my love from you was the worst mistake I ever made," Margaret replied. "And because I couldn't let you get married without knowing how much you mean to me." Jennifer looked at Margaret for several long moments, then slowly reached toward her mother. Margaret met her daughter halfway, and they embraced in the church pew surrounded by wedding decorations and colored light from the stained glass windows. Both women cried as they held each other for the first time in years. "I'm sorry I shut you out of the wedding," Jennifer whispered into her mother's shoulder. "I was so hurt and angry, but I never stopped wanting you here." Margaret held her daughter tighter and spoke through her tears. "I'm sorry I made you feel like you weren't important to me. You were always the most important thing in my life, even when I failed to show it." They sat holding each other in the quiet sanctuary while morning sunlight illuminated the letters scattered between them. Jennifer pulled back and looked at her mother with red but hopeful eyes. "Will you stay for the wedding?" Jennifer asked softly. Margaret's face brightened with joy and relief. "I would be honored to watch you marry David," Margaret replied. Jennifer smiled through her tears and picked up the envelope of letters. "I want to carry one of these letters with me during the ceremony," Jennifer said. "So you'll be with me every step down the aisle." Jennifer sat in the bridal room, wearing her beautiful white wedding dress, reading one of Margaret's letters for the third time. The letter was dated 2 years ago after Margaret had watched Jennifer work with patients at the hospital. Jennifer's hands trembled as she read her mother's written words about being proud of her compassion and dedication to healing others. Tears threatened to smudge her carefully applied makeup as Jennifer absorbed the love expressed in her mother's handwriting. Her bridesmaids bustled around the room, making final preparations, but Jennifer was focused entirely on the letter in her lap. "I never knew she noticed these things about me," Jennifer whispered to herself. The letter described specific moments when Margaret had observed Jennifer's kindness with patients, her gentle bedside manner, and her natural ability to comfort families during difficult times. Jennifer folded the letter carefully and held it against her heart. Margaret stood behind Jennifer, adjusting her daughter's wedding veil with gentle, careful hands. Both women looked at their reflection in the full-length mirror, seeing mother and daughter together for the first time in years. Jennifer's wedding dress was elegant and simple, with delicate lace details that complemented her natural beauty. Margaret's fingers worked skillfully with the veil, arranging it perfectly around Jennifer's shoulders. "You look absolutely radiant," Margaret said softly, meeting Jennifer's eyes in the mirror reflection. Jennifer reached up and covered her mother's hands with her own as they worked together. "I used to dream about this moment when I was little," Jennifer said quietly. "I would imagine you helping me get ready for my wedding day." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she continued adjusting the veil. "I'm so grateful I get to be here with you now," Margaret replied. The bridesmaids watched the tender moment between mother and daughter with smiles on their faces. Margaret sat beside Jennifer on the small sofa in the bridal room, the manila envelope and several letters spread on the coffee table before them. "I want you to understand why I worked so much after your father died," Margaret said, looking directly at Jennifer. "I was terrified of losing our house, of not being able to send you to college, of failing to provide the opportunities you deserved." Jennifer listened intently while holding one of the letters. "But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what you actually needed from me," Margaret continued. "You needed your mother to be present, not just providing." Jennifer nodded as Margaret spoke. "I convinced myself that working 16-hour days was good parenting because it showed dedication to your future," Margaret said with regret in her voice. "I never realized that you would have preferred having me home for dinner every night, even if it meant living in a smaller house or wearing secondhand clothes." Jennifer reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. "I just wanted to feel important to you," Jennifer said softly. Jennifer looked down at the wedding dress she wore and then back at Margaret. "Do you know that I used to practice conversations with you in my head?" Jennifer asked, her voice filled with years of accumulated longing. Margaret shook her head, encouraging Jennifer to continue. "I would imagine telling you about my patients, about the little boy who was scared of needles, about the elderly woman who had no family visitors." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears as she spoke. "I would rehearse, sharing my dreams of specializing in pediatric nursing, my fears about whether I was good enough to help people heal." Margaret listened with her full attention, absorbing every word Jennifer shared. "But every time I try to start those real conversations with you, you seem distracted by work calls or tired from long days at the office," Jennifer continued. "So I eventually stopped trying and learned to keep my inner world to myself." Margaret's heart broke as she heard about all the conversations they had missed over the years. Margaret clasped her hands together and spoke with deep emotion to Jennifer. I was present for all of those moments in my heart, even when I failed to show it with my actions, Margaret said through her tears. Every night when I came home from work and saw your homework on the kitchen table, I would read through your assignments and feel so proud of your dedication to learning. Jennifer listened with surprise as Margaret continued. When you left thank you notes for Mrs. Henderson or drew pictures for our neighbors, I saved every single one because they showed me what a kind person you were becoming. Margaret reached for another letter from the table. I wrote about all of these small moments because they filled me with such joy, but I was too emotionally closed off to share that joy with you directly. Jennifer's expression softened as she heard her mother describe paying attention to details she had never realized Margaret noticed. You saw all of that? Jennifer asked with wonder. Margaret nodded emphatically. I saw everything, Jennifer. I celebrated everything. I just did it silently when I should have been celebrating with you. Jennifer picked up several more letters and read portions of each one, crying as she discovered years of her mother's hidden observations and pride. One letter described Margaret watching Jennifer volunteer at the animal shelter when she was 15. Another detailed Margaret's admiration for Jennifer's patience with difficult classmates in high school. There's a letter here about every phase of my life, Jennifer said with amazement. You wrote about things I didn't even know you knew about. Margaret smiled through her tears as Jennifer continued reading. This letter is about the time I stayed up all night studying for my nursing boards, Jennifer said, holding up another page. You wrote that you were proud of my determination and work ethic. Jennifer looked up at Margaret with red eyes. I thought you didn't notice when I was struggling or working hard. Margaret shook her head firmly. I noticed everything, sweetheart. I just failed miserably at showing you that your efforts mattered to me. Jennifer set down the letters and reached for her mother's hands. All these years I thought you were disappointed in me, Jennifer whispered. But these letters prove you were proud of me all along. Margaret and Jennifer embraced in the bridal room, both women crying as 20 years of misunderstanding began to dissolve. Jennifer's wedding dress rustled softly as she held her mother tightly. I'm so sorry I made you feel unimportant, Margaret whispered into Jennifer's hair. You were always the most important person in my world, even when I was terrible at showing it. Jennifer pulled back slightly to look at her mother's face. I'm sorry I shut you out of the wedding planning, Jennifer said through her tears. I was protecting myself from more disappointment, but I was also punishing both of us. Margaret cupped Jennifer's face gently in her hands. We both made mistakes because we were both hurting, Margaret said softly. But we don't have to keep hurting each other anymore. Jennifer nodded and smiled through her tears. I want you to walk me down the aisle, Jennifer said suddenly. Margaret's eyes widened with surprise and joy. Are you sure? Margaret asked hopefully. Jennifer picked up one of the letters from the table. These letters prove that you were always with me, even when I couldn't feel it. Now I want everyone to see us together. Jennifer and Margaret stood together in the bridal room, both smiling through their tears as they prepared for the wedding ceremony. Jennifer carefully folded one of Margaret's letters and tucked it into her bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. I want to carry your words with me when I walk down the aisle, Jennifer explained to her mother. Margaret watched with joy as Jennifer secured the letter among the flowers. Which letter did you choose? Margaret asked curiously. Jennifer smiled and adjusted the letter so a corner was visible among the roses. The one you wrote after my nursing school graduation, where you said watching me care for patients was like watching an angel at work. Margaret's breath caught in her throat at hearing Jennifer quote from the letter. You remembered those exact words? Margaret asked with amazement. Jennifer nodded and touched the letter gently. I've read it 5 times already. I'm going to read all of them tonight after the reception. Margaret took Jennifer's hands in hers and looked directly into her eyes. I promise you won't have to wonder about my love anymore. I'm going to show you every day how proud I am to be your mother. A gentle knock on the bridal room door interrupted Margaret and Jennifer's conversation. David's voice came through the door, speaking respectfully. Jennifer, The photographer is ready for the family photos before the ceremony begins. Jennifer looked at Margaret with a bright smile. That includes you now, Mom, Jennifer said happily. Margaret's face lit up with joy at being included in the wedding photography. I would love to be in your wedding photos, Margaret replied, smoothing her navy blue dress and checking her appearance in the mirror. Jennifer gathered her bouquet with Margaret's letter tucked safely inside the flowers. The two women walked toward the bridal room door together, their relationship transformed by 23 letters and decades of unspoken love finally shared. Margaret paused at the door and looked back at the scattered letters on the coffee table. Should we bring the other letters with us? Margaret asked. Jennifer shook her head with a smile. We have the rest of our lives to read them together, Jennifer said. Today is about starting fresh. Margaret nodded and opened the door, stepping into the hallway beside her daughter as they prepared to join the wedding celebration. Margaret and Jennifer walked together through the church hallway toward the sanctuary where David and the wedding guests were waiting. Jennifer's wedding dress flowed gracefully behind her as she walked arm in arm with her mother. Both women carried peaceful expressions, their relationship healed by honest communication and the revelation of Margaret's hidden love. The sounds of wedding music and guest conversations drifted from the sanctuary as they approached. Jennifer paused before entering the main part of the church and turned to Margaret one final time. Thank you for fighting for us, Jennifer said softly. Thank you for not giving up when I tried to push you away. Margaret squeezed her daughter's arm gently and smiled. Thank you for giving me the chance to show you how much I love you, Margaret replied. Now let's go celebrate your marriage to David and the beginning of our new relationship as mother and daughter. Jennifer nodded with joy and anticipation. Together, they entered the church sanctuary where family, friends, and a beautiful future awaited them both. Margaret walked arm in arm with Jennifer down the church aisle as wedding guests rose from their pews. Jennifer's white wedding dress flowed gracefully behind her while she carried her bouquet with Margaret's letter tucked among the white roses. The sanctuary was filled with family and friends who watched with amazement as mother and daughter walked together toward the altar where David waited with a huge smile. Margaret wore her navy blue dress with pride, her gray hair styled elegantly for her daughter's special day. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the church as they processed slowly down the aisle. Jennifer squeezed her mother's arm gently as they walked, both women smiling through tears of joy. Helen sat in the third row, beaming with happiness at seeing the reconciliation she had helped facilitate. The organ music swelled as they approached the altar where Pastor Williams stood ready to perform the ceremony. David stood at the altar wearing a black tuxedo, his face lighting up with joy as he watched Jennifer approach with her mother. His eyes showed both happiness for Jennifer and relief that the family conflict had been resolved before their wedding day. David had worried about Jennifer's sadness over her mother's absence, and seeing them together filled him with gratitude. Pastor Williams stood beside David, also smiling at the beautiful sight of mother and daughter walking together. The groomsmen lined up beside David, all dressed in matching black tuxedos with white boutonnieres. Jennifer's bridesmaids waited at the other side of the altar, holding bouquets of pink roses that complemented the white church decorations. As Margaret and Jennifer reached the altar, David stepped forward to meet his bride. The entire church fell silent except for the soft sounds of guests wiping away tears of joy at witnessing this family reunion during such a sacred moment. Margaret and Jennifer embraced at the altar in front of all the wedding guests, both women crying tears of happiness. The congregation watched in respectful silence as mother and daughter shared this intimate moment of reconciliation. Margaret held Jennifer tightly, whispering words of love and blessing into her daughter's ear. "I'm so proud of the woman you've become," Margaret said softly. "I'm so grateful to be here with you on your wedding day." Jennifer pulled back and looked at her mother with radiant joy. "Thank you for never giving up on us," Jennifer whispered back. Margaret kissed Jennifer's cheek gently and then turned to David, who had waited patiently for this family moment to conclude. "Take good care of my precious daughter," Margaret said to David with a smile. David nodded solemnly and shook Margaret's hand. I promise I will, David replied. Margaret stepped back and took her seat in the front pew as Pastor Williams prepared to begin the wedding ceremony. Pastor Williams stepped forward at the altar and addressed the wedding guests with a warm smile. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jennifer and David in holy matrimony. His voice carried clearly through the church sanctuary as guests settled into their seats. Marriage is a sacred covenant that joins two hearts, two families, and two futures into one blessed union. Pastor Williams looked directly at Margaret in the front pew as he continued. Today we also celebrate the power of love to heal relationships and bridge differences that once seemed impossible to overcome. Margaret dabbed her eyes with a tissue as the pastor spoke about family, forgiveness, and new beginnings. Jennifer and David stood facing each other at the altar, holding hands as they prepared to exchange vows. The church was filled with an atmosphere of joy and celebration as Pastor Williams continued with the traditional wedding ceremony. Let us remember that love requires both commitment and communication, both patience and presence, Pastor Williams said, emphasizing words that resonated deeply with Margaret's recent lessons about motherhood. Jennifer and David exchanged wedding vows at the altar while their families watched with joy. Jennifer spoke first, her voice clear and emotional as she promised to love, honor, and cherish David for all the days of her life. You saw the best in me even when I couldn't see it myself, Jennifer said to David. You encouraged me to heal the relationship with my mother, and for that I will be forever grateful. David responded with his own vows, promising to support Jennifer's career as a nurse and to always prioritize their relationship above all other commitments. I vow to be present for you in all the ways that matter, David said, his words carrying special meaning after the recent family reconciliation. Margaret listened to their vows from the front pew, tears streaming down her face as she heard her daughter speak about healing and presence. The young couple exchanged rings as Pastor Williams blessed their union. Jennifer's bouquet, still containing Margaret's letter, rested on the altar beside them as they made their lifetime promises to each other. Pastor Williams smiled broadly as he prepared to conclude the wedding ceremony. By the power vested in me and in the presence of these witnesses, I now pronounce you husband and wife, Pastor Williams announced to the congregation. David, you may kiss your bride. David and Jennifer kissed at the altar as the church erupted in applause and cheers from their wedding guests. Margaret clapped enthusiastically from the front pew, her face glowing with happiness at seeing her daughter married to a man who clearly adored her. The church organ began playing the recessional music as the newly married couple prepared to walk back down the aisle together. Jennifer picked up her bouquet and looked directly at Margaret, mouthing the words, "Thank you," to her mother. Margaret blew a kiss to her daughter as Jennifer and David began their walk down the aisle as husband and wife. Wedding guests threw flower petals and rice as the couple processed through the sanctuary. The celebration continued as family and friends followed the newlyweds out of the church toward the reception venue. At the wedding reception, Margaret danced with Jennifer during the traditional mother-daughter dance. The reception venue was beautifully decorated with white tablecloths, candles, and floral centerpieces that matched the church decorations. Wedding guests watched from their tables as mother and daughter swayed to soft music, both women smiling and talking quietly as they danced. This is everything I dreamed it would be when I was little, Jennifer said to Margaret as they moved together on the dance floor. I used to imagine dancing with you on my wedding someday. Margaret held her daughter close as they danced. I'm so sorry it took us so long to get here, Margaret replied. But I'm grateful we found our way back to each other. The wedding photographer captured their dance from multiple angles, preserving this moment of reconciliation and joy. Other couples joined them on the dance floor as the song continued, but Margaret and Jennifer remained focused on each other, making up for years of misconnections through this simple but meaningful dance together. Jennifer took the microphone during the reception dinner and addressed the wedding guests with a radiant smile. David, I want to thank everyone for being here to celebrate our wedding day with us. Jennifer began, her voice carrying clearly through the reception venue. Wedding guests raised their champagne glasses as Jennifer continued her speech. This day has been even more special than I imagined because my mother is here with us. Jennifer looked directly at Margaret, who sat at the head table wiping tears of joy. My mom and I learned something important today about the difference between love that is felt and love that is expressed, Jennifer said to the gathered crowd. We spent too many years assuming we knew what the other person was thinking instead of actually talking to each other. Margaret stood up and applauded her daughter's words, proud of Jennifer's wisdom and maturity. So tonight we celebrate not just my marriage to David, but also the healing of my relationship with my mom, Jennifer concluded. The wedding guests erupted in applause and cheers, many of them wiping away tears at this unexpected but beautiful addition to the wedding celebration. Margaret stood up at the reception and asked for the microphone, wanting to address the wedding guests herself. I hope you'll indulge me for just a moment, Margaret said, her voice slightly nervous but determined. The reception venue fell quiet as guests turned their attention to the mother of the bride. 28 years ago, I became a single mother and thought my job was to provide everything my daughter needed to succeed in life. Margaret looked at Jennifer, who listened intently from her seat beside David. I worked long hours, saved for college, and tried to give Jennifer every opportunity one never had, Margaret continued. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that what she needed most was simply my presence and attention. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she spoke. Today, my daughter gave me the greatest gift possible. She forgave me for my mistakes and welcomed me back in her life. The wedding guests listened in respectful silence as Margaret concluded. Jennifer, you are an extraordinary woman who brings healing and compassion to everyone around you. I am so proud to be your mother, and I promise to show you that pride every single day from now on. The wedding guests enjoyed the reception celebration, witnessing the beautiful family reconciliation between Margaret and Jennifer. Margaret sat with Jennifer and David at the head table, finally participating fully in her daughter's special day. As the reception ended, Jennifer and Margaret made plans to meet for lunch to read through all 23 letters together. I love you, Mom, Jennifer whispered as she hugged Margaret goodbye. I love you too, sweetheart, Margaret replied. As the newlyweds drove away, Margaret stood with other guests waving goodbye, her heart full of gratitude for second chances. What did you think of this emotional story? Have you experienced a similar family reconciliation? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from around the world. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more heartwarming family stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest inspiring content.